The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Prince William made his way through the ancient corridors. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls, each step measured and deliberate. Today was not going to be an ordinary day at the palace. Today, he had to make a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire royal establishment. Sergeant James Morrison had served the Royal Guard for 17 years. He was known throughout the palace as the model soldier, the one who never missed a day, never questioned an order, and carried himself with a kind of dignity that made even other guards stand a little straighter. His uniform was always immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his dedication to protecting the royal family was absolute, or at least that was what everyone believed. William had received the first report 3 weeks ago. It came across his desk in a plain brown envelope marked confidential. Inside were photographs, witness statements, and security footage that told a story nobody wanted to believe. Sergeant Morrison, the pride of the Royal Guard, had been involved in something that could potentially threaten the security of the entire royal family. The evidence showed Morrison meeting with a journalist from a tabloid newspaper. At first, this might not seem alarming. Guards are human, after all, and they have lives outside the palace walls. But the meetings were frequent, always in secluded locations, and always followed by stories in the press that contained information only someone inside the palace would know. Details about the daily routines of the royals, the locations of security cameras, the timing of guard changes, and even private conversations that should never have left the palace walls. William spent sleepless nights reviewing the evidence. He questioned the investigators, demanded more proof, and hoped desperately that there was some mistake. Morrison had been at his wedding. Morrison had stood guard when his children were born. Morrison had been there during some of the most vulnerable moments of his family's life. The betrayal cut deep, but the evidence was undeniable. The palace security team had wanted to handle it quietly. They suggested transferring Morrison to a different post, perhaps overseas, where he could fade into obscurity without causing a scandal. But William knew that would be wrong. Someone in a position of trust had violated that trust. It needed to be addressed directly and transparently. Sweeping it under the carpet was exactly the kind of old palace thinking that had caused problems for the monarchy in the past. On the morning, William made his decision, called for a meeting with the head of palace security, his private secretary, and 2 senior members of the Royal Guard. They gathered in a small conference room that overlooked the palace gardens. Through the window, William could see Morrison himself, standing at his post near the main entrance, looking every bit the perfect soldier. William laid out the evidence on the table. The security chief confirmed that they had completed their investigation and that Morrison had indeed been selling information to the press. The meetings had been going on for nearly 8 months. The money he received was deposited into an offshore account, carefully hidden but eventually traced back to him through financial records. The motive was surprisingly simple. Morrison's daughter had been diagnosed with a rare medical condition that required expensive treatment, not fully covered by the National Health Service. He was a proud man who had always provided for his family, and when faced with mounting medical bills and the prospect of his daughter's suffering, he made a choice. It was the wrong choice, but it was a human one. William listened to all of this, his face grave. He understood the circumstances, and part of him felt genuine sympathy for Morrison's situation. But sympathy could not override the fundamental breach of trust. The security of his family, of his children, could not be compromised, no matter how understandable the reasons. The decision was made. Morrison would be removed from his position immediately. He would be stripped of his rank and dismissed from the Royal Guard. There would be no quiet transfer, no gentle retirement package. The dismissal would be public, and it would serve as a clear message that breaches of trust would not be tolerated, regardless of who committed them or why. What William did not anticipate was what would happen next. He thought the dismissal would be difficult but straightforward. He thought it would send the right message and allow everyone to move forward. He had no idea that his decision to do the right thing would trigger a chain of events that would expose secrets far darker than anything Morrison had revealed to the tabloids. The order was given at 10 in the morning. Morrison was to be summoned to the guard commander's office and informed of his dismissal. His security clearance would be revoked immediately, his uniform and credentials surrendered, and he would be escorted from the palace grounds. It was cold and efficient, the way such things had to be handled. But when the guards went to summon Morrison, they found his post abandoned. The soldier who should have been standing at attention near the main entrance was nowhere to be found. His rifle was still in its secure holder, his helmet sat on a nearby table, but Morrison himself had vanished. Palace security immediately went into high alert. A guard disappearing from his post was unprecedented, especially one who knew he was about to be dismissed. Teams were dispatched to search the palace grounds. Every room, every corridor, every garden and courtyard was checked. Morrison's living quarters in the guard barracks were searched. His locker was opened. His personal belongings were examined. But there was no sign of him. It was as if he had simply evaporated into thin air. Then, at precisely noon, something happened that sent the entire palace into chaos. Morrison appeared on the main balcony of the palace, the same balcony where the royal family appeared during major celebrations. He was not in uniform. Instead, he wore civilian clothes and carried a large folder under his arm. Behind him, projected onto a white sheet he had somehow managed to hang, was a slideshow of documents, photographs, and records. Security rushed toward the balcony, but Morrison had barricaded the doors from inside. The balcony faced the main courtyard where tourists and members of the press often gathered. Within minutes, cameras were pointing upward, and smartphones were recording. Morrison had chosen the most public possible venue for whatever he was about to do. William was in a meeting when the news reached him. His private secretary burst into the room, something he would never normally do, and whispered urgently in his ear. William's face went pale. He immediately stood and rushed toward the balcony, but he knew he would not reach it in time to stop whatever Morrison had planned. On the balcony, Morrison began to speak. His voice was calm and clear, amplified by a small megaphone he had brought with him. He started by admitting everything. Yes, he had sold information to the press. Yes, he had betrayed his oath. Yes, he deserved to be dismissed. But then he said something that made everyone listening freeze. He said he was not the only one. Morrison claimed that the corruption within the palace security was far more extensive than anyone realized. He claimed that several high-ranking officials had been involved in various schemes for years. From selling information to embezzling funds meant for security improvements, he claimed that some of these officials had known about his activities and had actually encouraged them, taking a cut of his payments in exchange for their silence. The folder he carried contained copies of financial records, communications, and evidence of what he claimed was systematic corruption. He said he had made copies and sent them to multiple news organizations, lawyers, and government officials. He said the truth would come out whether the palace liked it or not. For 20 minutes, Morrison spoke to the growing crowd below. He detailed meetings that had taken place, money that had changed hands, and decisions that had been made to protect certain individuals while sacrificing others. He named names, including some of the most respected figures in palace security and administration. Some of what he said sounded outlandish, like the desperate accusations of a man trying to save himself. But some of it had the ring of truth, specific details that would be hard to fabricate. Finally, security managed to break through the barricaded doors. They rushed onto the balcony and restrained Morrison. The slideshow stopped, the megaphone was taken away, and Morrison was led back inside the palace. But the damage was done. The cameras had captured everything. Within an hour, the footage was trending worldwide. News organizations were scrambling to verify the claims. Reporters were calling every contact they had inside the palace. William stood in the corridor outside the balcony, watching as Morrison was led past him in handcuffs. Their eyes met for just a moment. Morrison's expression was not defiant or angry. Instead, he looked tired and sad, like a man who had reached the end of a very long road. William said nothing. There was nothing to say. The decision to remove Morrison had been right, but the consequences were unfolding in ways nobody could have predicted. By evening, the palace was under siege. Not physically, but the media attention was unlike anything they had experienced in years. Every news channel was covering the story. Royal experts were being interviewed. Former palace employees were being tracked down for comment. The palace press office was overwhelmed with requests for statements, clarifications, and interviews. William called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. They gathered in the same conference room where the decision to dismiss Morrison had been made just hours earlier. Now, instead of dealing with one problematic guard, they were facing a potential crisis that threatened to engulf the entire institution. If even some of Morrison's accusations were true, the implications were staggering. If they were false, the palace still had to deal with the public perception and the damage to their reputation. The head of palace security, Sir Edmund Hartley, sat at the table looking shaken. He had been in his position for 12 years and was considered beyond reproach. But Morrison had named him specifically, claiming that Hartley had known about the leaks and had taken money to look the other way. Hartley vehemently denied the accusations, called them the lies of a desperate man trying to deflect blame. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a momentary hesitation that made William wonder. The decision was made to launch a full internal investigation. An independent team would be brought in to examine all of Morrison's claims. Every financial record would be audited. Every security protocol would be reviewed. Nothing would be hidden. Nothing would be protected. If there was corruption, it would be rooted out completely, no matter who was involved or how high it went. William knew this was going to be painful. He knew that the investigation would likely uncover uncomfortable truths. Institutions as old as the monarchy always had their dark corners, places where things happened that should not have happened. But he also knew that this was an opportunity. If handled correctly, this crisis could lead to real reform, to a more transparent and accountable system. If handled incorrectly, it could be a disaster that damaged the monarchy for generations. As the meeting ended and staff members filed out, William remained seated. He looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Morrison was being held in a secure location, waiting to be formally charged. Somewhere out there, reporters were digging through documents and making phone calls. And somewhere out there, if Morrison was telling the truth, other people involved in the corruption were probably panicking, wondering if they would be exposed next. William had removed a royal guard from his position because it was the right thing to do. He had expected consequences, but not like this. Now the entire palace was humiliated, their dirty laundry aired in the most public way possible. The question was no longer whether Morrison should have been dismissed. The question was, what would happen now? And whether the monarchy could survive the revelations that were yet to come. The investigation began within 48 hours of Morrison's dramatic balcony appearance. William personally selected the team that would lead it. He chose people from outside the palace system. Investigators with backgrounds in financial crimes and institutional corruption. He wanted people who had no loyalty to anyone inside the palace. People who would follow the evidence wherever it led. The team was led by Margaret Chen, a former prosecutor who had made her reputation taking down corrupt politicians and business executives. She was known for her thoroughness and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful people. When William met with her to explain the situation, she listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and then accepted the assignment with one condition. She wanted complete access to everything and everyone. No locked doors, no sealed files, no protected witnesses. William agreed immediately. The first week of the investigation was chaos. Chen and her team moved through the palace like a storm, interviewing staff members, examining financial records, and reviewing security footage going back years. They set up their operations in a wing of the palace that had been cleared for their use. With armed guards posted outside to ensure nobody interfered with their work, Morrison himself was being held in a secure facility outside London. He had been arrested immediately after being removed from the balcony, charged with breach of official secrets and several other offenses. His lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah Pemberton, had advised him to cooperate fully with the investigation. Morrison agreed. He had already burned his bridges. Now his only hope was that telling the complete truth might earn him some leniency. Over several days, Chen's team interviewed Morrison for hours at a time. He walked them through everything from his first contact with the tabloid journalist to the elaborate system he had. developed for passing information without being detected. He explained how he had become desperate to pay for his daughter's medical treatment, how he had rationalized his actions by telling himself he was not revealing anything that would truly endanger the royal family, but then he revealed something more significant. He explained how, about 4 months into his arrangement with the journalist, he had been approached by someone inside the palace security apparatus, a man he had known for years, someone senior to him, who had somehow learned about his activities. Morrison had expected to be arrested immediately. Instead, the man had made him an offer. The man's name was Deputy Security Director Thomas Blackwood. He told Morrison that he knew about the leaks and had evidence that could destroy him. But instead of reporting Morrison, Blackwood proposed a partnership. Blackwood himself had been selling different kinds of information to various interested parties for years. He had contacts in the media, in private security firms, and in foreign intelligence services. He was not selling critical security secrets, nothing that would get anyone killed. But he was profiting from his position in ways that were clearly illegal. Blackwood saw Morrison as both a threat and an opportunity. If Morrison was caught, there was a risk he might expose others to save himself. Better to bring him into the fold, to make him complicit in the larger operation. So Blackwood offered Morrison protection in exchange for a cut of his earnings and occasional assistance with other matters. Morrison had agreed. What choice did he have? He was already a criminal. Refusing Blackwood would have meant immediate arrest. So for the next 4 months, Morrison had been part of something larger than his own individual crime. He had helped Blackwood coordinate the sale of information about palace security, measures to a private firm that provided security for wealthy individuals. He had looked the other way when Blackwood manipulated guard schedules to accommodate personal business. He had even helped Blackwood plant false information in palace records to cover his tracks. When Chun's team heard all of this, they knew they were dealing with something far bigger than they had initially thought. Morrison had been a symptom, not the disease. The real problem was Blackwood and potentially others like him, who had been using their positions for personal gain for years. The investigation of Blackwood began immediately. His financial records were seized and analyzed. His home was searched. His communications were examined, and what they found was stunning. Blackwood had accumulated wealth far beyond what his salary could explain. He owned properties in 3 different countries, had multiple bank accounts, and had made investments that suggested access to insider information. But Blackwood was not going down quietly. When Chun's team arrived at his office to question him, he was calm and prepared. He had his own lawyer present, a man who specialized in defending high-profile corruption cases. Blackwood denied everything. He claimed Morrison was lying to reduce his own sentence. He had explanations for all of his wealth, family inheritances, successful investments, money from his wife's family business. His lawyers presented documentation for everything. Chen knew this was going to be difficult. Blackwood had been smart. He had covered his tracks well. The evidence Morrison provided was substantial, but much of it was circumstantial. Blackwood's lawyers would argue that it was the word of a confessed criminal against the word of a decorated security professional. Unless Chen could find harder evidence, Blackwood might walk away. Meanwhile, the media frenzy continued. Every day brought new headlines, new speculation, new leaks from inside the investigation. Some of these leaks were accurate, others were wildly off base, but all of them kept the story alive in the public consciousness. The palace's reputation was taking a beating. Opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy. Questions were being raised in Parliament about oversight of royal security. William found himself in an impossible position. He wanted to address the public, to explain what was happening. But his lawyers and advisors warned him that anything he said could compromise the investigation. So he remained silent, appearing at official functions with a composed expression while privately dealing with the stress of watching his family's institution being torn apart. Catherine, his wife, was a steady presence through all of this. She reminded him that transparency was painful but necessary. She pointed out that the monarchy had survived worse scandals and that the only way forward was complete honesty. William knew she was right, but that did not make it any easier. Then, 3 weeks into the investigation, Chen's team made a breakthrough. They found it in an unlikely place, in the personal computer of Sir Edmund Hartley, the head of palace security whom Morrison had also accused. Hartley had continued to deny any wrongdoing, but Chen had insisted on examining his devices anyway. Deep in his email archives, they found correspondence with Blackwood that showed Hartley had known about at least some of Blackwood's activities. The emails were carefully worded, never explicit, but the meaning was clear to anyone reading them. Hartley had been aware that Blackwood was involved in questionable activities. He had not participated directly, but he had protected Blackwood, had made sure investigations never got too close, had steered attention away whenever questions arose. In exchange, Blackwood had been loyal to Hartley, had helped him look good by manipulating security reports and ensuring that problems were solved before they reached Hartley's desk. It was not the massive corruption conspiracy that Morrison had suggested, but it was something perhaps worse in its own way. It was institutional rot, the kind of mutual protection and looking the other way that allowed real problems to fester. Hartley had not been stealing money, but he had been protecting someone who was, and he had been doing it to protect his own reputation and position. When confronted with this evidence, Hartley's composure finally cracked. He did not confess outright, but his denials became weaker, more qualified. His lawyer began discussing the possibility of a plea arrangement. Within days, Hartley resigned from his position, citing health reasons. Everyone knew what it really meant. With Hartley's effective admission of guilt, the case against Blackwood became stronger. Prosecutors began building a formal case. They had Morrison's testimony. They had the circumstantial evidence of Blackwood's unexplained wealth. And now they had proof that his superior had been protecting him. It was enough to charge Blackwood with multiple crimes, from bribery to money laundering to betrayal of official trust. The charges were filed on a Wednesday morning. Blackwood was arrested at his home, led out in handcuffs in front of cameras that had been tipped off to be there. The image of him being placed into a police car, his face stony and defiant, became the defining image of the scandal. But the arrests did not end the crisis. If anything, they intensified it. Now the question was not whether corruption had existed, but how deep it went. Were Morrison, Blackwood, and Hartley the only ones? Or were there others who had not yet been exposed? Chen's team continued their work, but public confidence in palace security was at an all-time low. William knew he had to do something dramatic to restore trust. He called a meeting with his senior advisors and announced his decision. The entire palace security apparatus would be restructured from top to bottom. New leadership would be brought in from outside. Every position would be reviewed. New oversight mechanisms would be established. And most controversially, William wanted to invite external audits of palace security on a regular basis, something that had never been done before. The old guard at the palace was horrified. Inviting outsiders to examine palace security was unprecedented. It went against centuries of tradition that said the royal household managed its own affairs. But William was adamant. The days of secrecy and self-regulation were over. If the monarchy was going to survive in the modern era, it needed to embrace transparency and accountability, even when it was uncomfortable. His decision was announced in a carefully prepared statement. William appeared on camera, speaking directly to the public for the first time since the scandal had broken. He looked tired, but determined. He acknowledged the breach of trust, apologized for the failures that had allowed it to happen, outlined the reforms he was implementing. He did not make excuses or try to minimize what had occurred. He simply told the truth and promised to do better. The response was mixed. Some praised his honesty and his willingness to make real changes. Others criticized him for not acting sooner, for not preventing the problems in the first place. Political opponents of the monarchy used the scandal as ammunition for their calls to abolish or drastically reduce the royal family's role. Supporters rallied around William, arguing that his response showed exactly the kind of leadership the monarchy needed. Through all of this, there was one person who remained at the center of everyone's thoughts: Morrison himself. He was still in custody, awaiting trial for his crimes. His daughter had received the medical treatment she needed, paid for by money he had earned through betrayal. She was recovering, unaware of the price her father had paid to save her life. In her cell at the investigation facility, Sarah Pemberton, Morrison's lawyer, was negotiating with prosecutors. Given Morrison's cooperation and the role he had played in exposing the larger corruption, there was discussion of a reduced sentence. But nothing was certain. Morrison had still committed serious crimes. He had endangered the royal family and violated his oath. The prosecutors were under pressure to seek significant punishment to serve as a deterrent to others. As the second month of the investigation began, Chen's team believed they were nearing the end of their work. They had interviewed over 300 people, reviewed millions of documents, and traced countless financial transactions. They had found evidence of corruption involving Morrison, Blackwood, and Hartley, plus 2 lower-level officials who had been involved in minor schemes. It was serious, but it was also contained. There was no vast conspiracy, no foreign intelligence operation. It's just a handful of people who had made bad choices for various reasons. Chen prepared her final report, a comprehensive document that detailed everything they had found. It would be devastating for those involved, but it would also provide a roadmap for the reforms that were needed. She scheduled a meeting with William to present her findings. But then, just days before that meeting was scheduled to take place, something happened that changed everything once again. A new witness came forward, someone from outside the palace entirely, claimed to have information that would expose something far more serious than anything Morrison or Blackwood had been involved in. This witness had evidence, they claimed, of a systematic effort to manipulate security protocols in ways that had nothing to do with money or personal gain. They claimed it was about power, about controlling access to the royal family, about influencing decisions at the highest levels of the monarchy. When Chen heard about this witness, she knew immediately that her investigation was not over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The scandal that had started with one dismissed guard was about to evolve into something that would shake the foundations of the British monarchy in ways that nobody, not even Morrison in his most dramatic moment on that balcony, could have imagined. The new witness was a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Thornton. She was a cybersecurity consultant who had worked on a contract basis for the palace 3 years earlier. Her job had been to assess the palace's digital security systems and recommend upgrades. She had completed her work, submitted her report, and moved on to other clients. She had no reason to stay connected to the palace after her contract ended, but she had kept copies of everything she had found, just as any thorough professional would. When the Morrison scandal broke and the investigation began, Thornton watched the news coverage like everyone else. She saw the accusations about corruption and security breaches. She saw William's promise of transparency and reform. And she began to wonder whether she had a responsibility to share what she knew. What she knew was troubling. During her assessment of palace security systems, she had discovered anomalies in the access logs for several critical security databases. These databases controlled who could enter various parts of the palace, who had access to security camera feeds, and who could modify security protocols. The anomalies suggested that someone had been accessing these systems without proper authorization and making changes that should have required multiple approvals at the time. Thornton had reported these findings to her palace contacts. She had been assured that the matter would be investigated and resolved. She had assumed it was probably a technical glitch, or perhaps a low-level employee cutting corners. She had never imagined it might be something more serious. But now, watching the scandal unfold, she wondered whether those anomalies had been connected to the corruption that was being exposed. Thornton contacted Margaret Chen's office and requested a confidential meeting. Chen, always thorough, agreed to meet with her even though the investigation was supposedly winding down. They met in a secure location away from the palace, just the two of them, with Chen's recording device sitting on the table between them. For 2 hours, Thornton explained what she had found. She showed Chen the technical documentation, the access logs, the evidence of unauthorized changes to security protocols. Chen listened carefully, asked technical questions, and felt a growing sense of dread. If what Thornton was showing her was accurate, then someone had been systematically manipulating palace security systems for years, long before Morrison had ever sold his first piece of information to a journalist. The implications were staggering. Whoever had been doing this had not been stealing money or leaking information to tabloids. They had been doing something much more sophisticated. They had been positioning themselves to control access to the royal family, to know where they were at all times, to potentially compromise their safety in ways that could not be traced back to any individual action, Chen immediately expanded her investigation. She brought in digital forensics experts, people who specialized in tracking down sophisticated cyber intrusions. She pulled Thornton onto the team as a consultant, and she began the painstaking process of reconstructing what had happened in the palace's computer systems over the past 5 years. What they found was shocking. The unauthorized access had been ongoing for at least that long, possibly longer. Someone with high-level technical skills had created backdoor access to critical systems. They had been careful covering their tracks, but not careful enough to fool experts who knew what to look for. The trail led through multiple layers of security, through encrypted communications and proxy servers, but eventually, patterns began to emerge. The access had come from inside the palace network. That much was clear. But determining who inside the palace had the skills and access to do this was more difficult. The team created a list of suspects, people who had the technical knowledge and the security clearance to potentially be responsible. There were about 30 names on the initial list. Chen's team began investigating each person on the list. They examined work histories, technical certifications, communications, and behavioral patterns. Slowly, the list narrowed. Some people could be eliminated because they had not been at the palace during key periods when changes were made. Others were eliminated because they lacked the necessary skills. After 3 weeks of intensive work, the list was down to 5 names. One of those names was Andrew Fletcher. He was the palace's senior IT administrator, responsible for maintaining and upgrading all digital systems. He was 52 years old, had worked at the palace for 14 years, and was considered absolutely reliable. His background checks had always been spotless. He had no financial problems, no obvious vulnerabilities, no reason to betray his position. But he had the skills and the access to do everything that Thornton had discovered. Chen ordered surveillance on Fletcher. His communications were monitored, his computer activity was logged, and investigators followed him when he left the palace each day. For a week, nothing suspicious emerged. Fletcher appeared to be exactly what he seemed to be, a dedicated IT professional doing his job. But then, on a Thursday evening, Fletcher deviated from his normal routine. Instead of going home after work, he drove to a small cafe in a quiet neighborhood. He sat at a corner table and waited. 20 minutes later, another man entered the cafe. This man sat down across from Fletcher. They talked for about 30 minutes, their conversation too quiet for the surveillance team outside to hear. Then they both left, going in different directions. The surveillance team photographed the other man and ran facial recognition. The results sent shockwaves through the investigation. The man was David Winters, a mid-level official in the British intelligence service. He worked in a division that dealt with protective security for high-value individuals. His presence at a clandestine meeting with the palace's administrator raised immediate red flags. Chen contacted her counterparts in the intelligence service and requested information about Winters. What came back was carefully worded but deeply concerning. Winters was under internal review for undisclosed reasons. He had recently been moved to a less sensitive position. There were questions about his loyalties and his activities over the past several years. The intelligence service was conducting its own investigation, but it was moving slowly, hampered by bureaucratic procedures and the sensitive nature of investigating one of their own. Chen made a decision. She contacted William directly and requested an urgent private meeting. When they met, she laid out everything she had discovered: the unauthorized access to security systems, the connection to Fletcher, the mysterious meeting with Winters, and the intelligence service's concerns about Winters. She explained that they might be dealing with something far more serious than corruption or information leaks. They might be dealing with a compromised security system and a potential intelligence operation targeting the royal family. William listened in stunned silence. He had thought the worst was over, that the investigation was winding down and reforms were being implemented. Now he was being told that someone might have been systematically manipulating palace security for years, with possible connections to the intelligence services. The implications for his family's safety were terrifying. Chen recommended immediate action. Fletcher needed to be confronted and questioned. Winters needed to be investigated thoroughly by both Chen's team and the intelligence service. And in the meantime, every aspect of palace security needed to be audited and potentially rebuilt from scratch. Until they knew the full extent of the compromise, they had to assume that the royal family's security could not be trusted. William approved everything. That night, Fletcher was detained as he arrived for work the next morning. He was brought to a secure interview room where Chen and her team were waiting. When confronted with the evidence of his unauthorized access to security systems and his meeting with Winters, Fletcher's reaction was not what anyone expected. He did not deny it. Instead, he looked almost relieved. Fletcher explained that he had been recruited by Winters 5 years earlier. Winters had approached him at a technical conference, had befriended him gradually, and had eventually made a proposition. The intelligence service, Winters claimed, needed to maintain independent oversight of palace security. It was not about spying on the royal family, Winters had said, but about ensuring their safety. There were threats that the palace security team might not be aware of, and the intelligence service needed a way to monitor situations independently. Fletcher had been hesitant at first, but Winters had been persuasive. He had shown Fletcher classified briefings about threats to the royal family. He had convinced Fletcher that what he was asking for was legal and necessary, authorized at high levels of government. Fletcher had believed him. For 5 years, Fletcher had given Winters access to palace security systems, believing he was helping to protect the royal family, not compromise them. But as time went on, Fletcher had begun to have doubts. He noticed that Winters seemed interested in things that had nothing to do with security threats. He wanted access to scheduling information, to private communications, to details about the royal family's personal lives. When Fletcher questioned this, Winters had become evasive, claiming it was all part of comprehensive security monitoring. Fletcher had wanted to stop cooperating, but by then it was too late. He was compromised. If he went to his superiors, he would be arrested for treason. So he had continued, hoping that nothing truly harmful would come of it. Chen listened to all of this and knew immediately that they needed to bring in the intelligence service officially. This was beyond the scope of her investigation. If a rogue intelligence officer had been using Fletcher to spy on the royal family for his own purposes, that was a matter of national security. Within hours, senior officials from the intelligence service arrived at the palace. They met with Chen, with William, and with Fletcher. Winters was detained by intelligence service investigators and brought in for questioning. Over the next several days, a picture emerged that was both more and less disturbing than anyone had feared. Winters had indeed been acting without proper authorization. He had not been running an official intelligence operation. Instead, he had been using his position and his access to gather information that he then used for personal gain. He had been selling information about the royal family's schedules and movements to private security firms who used that information to better protect their own clients. If they knew when the royals would be at certain locations, they could adjust their own security arrangements accordingly. It was not a foreign intelligence operation. It was not an attempt to harm the royal family, but it was still a massive breach of security and trust. Winters had compromised palace security systems for years, all to make money on the side. He had convinced Fletcher to help him by lying about his authorization and his purposes. And in doing so, he had created vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by others with more malicious intent. The intelligence service was deeply embarrassed. One of their own had used his position to run what amounted to a private intelligence operation for profit. They immediately launched a full review of their own security procedures. Winters was arrested and charged with numerous offenses. Fletcher, who had been a dupe rather than a willing conspirator, was also charged, but prosecutors indicated they would recommend leniency, given his cooperation and his belief that he had been acting legally. For William and the palace, the revelation was both a relief and a new crisis. The relief came from knowing that this had not been a foreign plot or an attempt to harm his family. The crisis came from the realization that their security had been compromised for years without anyone noticing. If Fletcher and Winters had gone undetected, how many other vulnerabilities might exist? The palace security restructuring that William had announced after Morrison's exposure now became even more urgent and comprehensive. Every system was audited by outside experts. Every employee with security access was revetted. New protocols were established that required multiple levels of approval for any changes to security systems. External oversight was not just invited but mandated. With regular audits by independent security firms and government agencies, the media, when they learned about the Fletcher and Winters revelations, went into overdrive once again. This was no longer just a story about a corrupt guard and some palace officials taking bribes. This was a story about intelligence service officers compromising royal security for profit. It was the kind of scandal that dominated headlines for weeks and prompted calls for investigations at the highest levels of government. Parliament launched its own inquiry into the security failures. William was called to testify, something that was unprecedented for a member of the royal family. He appeared before the committee and answered questions for 3 hours. He was honest about the failures, supportive of the reforms being implemented, and clear that accountability was essential at every level. His testimony won him respect even from critics of the monarchy. He was not hiding behind protocol or tradition. He was engaging directly with the democratic process and accepting that the royal family needed to be accountable to the public. It was a defining moment for his approach to the monarchy, a signal that things were changing. Through all of this, Morrison remained in custody, his own case now seeming almost minor compared to the larger scandals that had emerged. His lawyer continued to negotiate his sentence. The prosecutors, recognizing that Morrison's initial exposure had led to the discovery of far more serious problems, were inclined to be somewhat lenient. Morrison would serve time, certainly, but perhaps not as much as he might have faced initially. As the third month of investigations came to a close, Chen prepared her second and truly final report. This one was even longer than the first, detailing not just the corruption she had initially investigated, but the security compromises that had followed. She made dozens of recommendations for reforms, from changes in hiring and vetting procedures to complete overhauls of digital security systems. William read the report in one sitting. It was damning, but it was also thorough and fair. Chen had not tried to protect anyone or minimize any failures. She had simply documented what she found and explained what needed to change. It was exactly what William had asked for when he had launched this process. The question now was whether the monarchy could recover from this level of exposure and humiliation. Every failure had been laid bare. Every weakness had been revealed. The institution that prided itself on dignity and tradition had been shown to be as vulnerable to human failings as any other. Some argued this would be the beginning of the end for the royal family. Others believed it was an opportunity for renewal and reform. William knew which side he was on. The humiliation had been intense and painful, but it had also been necessary. The rot needed to be exposed before it could be removed. The failures needed to be acknowledged before they could be corrected. And now, perhaps, the monarchy could move forward with systems and safeguards that would prevent such failures in the future. The path forward would not be easy. But at least now, they were finally on it. 6 months had passed since William made the decision to remove Sergeant James Morrison from his position in the Royal Guard. Half a year since Morrison's dramatic appearance on the palace balcony. Half a year since the investigations, the arrests, the revelations, and the humiliation that had followed. Now, as winter gave way to spring, the palace was finally beginning to emerge from the shadow of scandal. The trials had been front-page news for weeks. Blackwood, the deputy security director who had profited from selling information, received a 7-year prison sentence. Sir Edmund Hartley, who had protected Blackwood and turned a blind eye to corruption, received 2 years, though he was allowed to serve his time in a low-security facility given his age and health. David Winters, the intelligence officer who had compromised palace security for personal gain, received 10 years in a more serious facility. The judge in his case made clear that his abuse of his position in the intelligence service made his crimes particularly egregious. Morrison himself had faced trial last month. His lawyer, Sarah Pemberton, had argued for leniency based on his cooperation with investigators and the desperate circumstances that had led to his initial crime. The prosecution acknowledged these factors but insisted that betraying his oath still warranted serious punishment. In the end, the judge sentenced Morrison to 4 years. with the possibility of parole after 2 if he demonstrated good behavior. It was not as harsh as it could have been, but it was still substantial. Morrison's daughter was now healthy. The expensive treatment had worked, and she was expected to make a full recovery. She would grow up knowing that her father had saved her life, but also that he had paid a terrible price for doing so. It was a complicated legacy, but then, life was often complicated. Fletcher, the IT administrator who had been manipulated by Winters, received a suspended sentence and community service. The court recognized that he had genuinely believed he was acting in service of palace security. He had been foolish and should have questioned what he was being asked to do, but he had not acted with criminal intent. He lost his job and his security clearance, but he avoided prison. It was perhaps more mercy than he deserved, but it was also recognition that not everyone who had been part of the scandal had been equally culpable. The reforms William had promised were now being implemented. The entire palace security structure had been rebuilt. New leadership had been brought in from outside the royal household. Amanda Porter, a former police commander with an outstanding reputation for integrity and competence, was now head of palace security. She had no loyalty to the old system and no interest in protecting anyone who was not doing their job properly. Under Porter's leadership, security protocols were completely revised. The days of a handful of people having unchecked access to critical systems were over. Now, every significant security decision required multiple approvals. Every change to access protocols was logged and reviewed. Regular audits by outside firms ensured that problems would be caught early. The system was not perfect. No system ever could be. But it was dramatically better than what had existed before. The digital security systems had been rebuilt from the ground up. Every piece of software was examined, every vulnerability was addressed, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent the kind of unauthorized access that Fletcher had provided to Winters. The palace had hired its own team of cybersecurity experts. People with no connection to any intelligence service or outside organization, whose only job was to protect the integrity of palace systems. But the changes went beyond just security. The scandal had exposed broader problems with how the palace operated. There had been too much secrecy, too little oversight, too much reliance on tradition and assumed loyalty instead of actual accountability. William had used the crisis as an opportunity to push for changes that had been needed for years, but had been resisted by those who preferred the old ways. The palace finances were now subject to regular external audits, with reports made public. The hiring and vetting processes for all staff members were overhauled, with new checks and balances to ensure people were not just qualified but also trustworthy. A new ethics office was created where staff members could report concerns without fear of retaliation. An ombudsman position was established to investigate complaints and ensure that problems were addressed rather than buried. Not everyone was happy with these changes. Some members of the old palace establishment grumbled that tradition was being sacrificed. The monarchy was losing what made it special. There were whispers in certain circles that William was being too radical, too willing to appease critics, too ready to abandon the ways things had always been done. But William was unmoved by these criticisms. He had seen what the old system had produced: corruption, compromise, and a security apparatus that had been penetrated and manipulated for years. If that was what tradition protected, then tradition needed to change. The monarchy could either adapt to the modern world, or it could cling to the past and slowly lose relevance. He knew which path he wanted to take. Public opinion about the scandal had evolved over the months. The initial shock and outrage had given way to a more nuanced understanding. People recognized that what had happened was serious, but they also saw that William was taking real steps to address it. His willingness to testify before Parliament, his commitment to transparency, and the concrete reforms being implemented had won him a measure of respect. Opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy, which had dropped significantly during the worst of the scandal, had stabilized and was even beginning to recover. People were willing to give William credit for how he had handled the crisis. They saw him as someone who took responsibility and made hard choices. In a political landscape full of leaders who deflected blame and protected their own, his approach stood out. Catherine had been William's partner through all of this, had dealt with her own stress and worry while supporting him through the worst of it. She had continued with her public duties even as cameras followed her everywhere, looking for any sign of crisis. She had maintained her composure and her commitment to the work she believed in. And privately, she had reminded William on difficult days that doing the right thing was often painful, but always worthwhile. Their children had been mostly sheltered from the worst of the scandal. They were still young, and William and Catherine had worked hard to keep their lives as normal as possible. But the older children had asked questions, had wanted to know why there were so many cameras and why people were saying unkind things about their grandfather's house. William had explained in age-appropriate terms that sometimes people make mistakes, and that when that happens, you have to be honest about it and work to fix it. It was a lesson he hoped they would remember. On a warm April afternoon, William stood in the same palace gardens where he had looked out months earlier, wondering how his decision to remove one guard had spiraled into such a comprehensive crisis. The gardens looked the same, the ancient trees and carefully tended flowers unchanged by human drama. But William had changed, felt older, more aware of the complexities of leadership, more conscious of how even small decisions could have enormous consequences. Margaret Chen had completed her work and returned to her normal life. Before leaving, she had met with William one last time. She told him that what had happened at the palace was not unique. Every large institution had its problems, its failures, its individuals who abused their positions. What mattered was how those institutions responded when problems were exposed. Some circled the wagons and protected their own. Others faced the truth and made real changes. The palace, she said, had chosen the harder but better path. William had thanked her for her work and her honesty. He knew that without her investigation, many of the problems would never have been fully exposed. It would have been easier to handle Morrison's case quietly and avoid the larger scandal. But easier did not mean better. The pain of the past 6 months had been worth it if it meant the palace was now a more accountable and trustworthy institution. Morrison himself was adjusting to prison life. He had been placed in a facility with other white-collar criminals, people who had made bad choices but were not dangerous. He spent his days working in the prison library, helping other inmates with their legal research and letter writing. His daughter visited him regularly, accompanied by his wife. They were a family trying to rebuild after catastrophe. Knowing that the man who had saved his daughter's life would miss years of watching her grow up, in quieter moments, Morrison thought about that morning when he had climbed onto the palace balcony with his folder of evidence and his megaphone. He had been angry and desperate, determined to expose the corruption that he felt had made him a scapegoat. He had succeeded in that goal, perhaps more than he had ever imagined. The price had been high for everyone involved. Sometimes, Morrison wondered if things could have been different. If he had gone to his superiors when Blackwood first approached him, would they have listened? If he had refused to be drawn into the larger conspiracy, would he have been protected or destroyed? If he had never sold that first piece of information to the tabloid, would his daughter have received the treatment she needed? No, the questions haunted him, but there were no answers that would change what had happened. Blackwood, in his own prison cell in a harsher facility, had no such regrets. He felt he had been unlucky, that he had been doing what many others did but had been caught while they had not. He blamed Morrison for exposing him and William for not having the sense to handle things quietly. He counted down the days of his sentence and planned for when he would be released, still convinced that he had done nothing truly wrong. Winters, the intelligence officer, had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom. He had been so clever, had thought he was too smart to be caught, and had been utterly stunned when it all came crashing down. In prison, he replayed his decisions, trying to identify where he had gone wrong. He had concluded that his mistake had been involving Fletcher. If he had found a way to access the palace systems himself, he might never have been exposed. Was a technical analysis of failure, free from any real recognition of ethical wrongdoing. Back at the palace, Amanda Porter was leading the new security team through another training exercise. They practiced responding to various scenarios, from cyber attacks to physical intrusions to insider threats. Porter emphasized that security was not just about following procedures, but about maintaining vigilance and integrity. She told her team that they were part of something new, a security apparatus that was transparent, accountable, and trustworthy. She expected them to live up to those standards. The media attention had finally begun to fade. There were new scandals to cover, new stories to pursue. The palace security scandal was becoming history, a case study that would be examined in training courses for years to come, but was no longer front-page news. For those who had lived through it, this fading of attention was both a relief and something else. The intensity had been exhausting, but it had also felt important. A life was returning to normal, and normal sometimes felt anticlimactic. William had been invited to give a speech at a conference on institutional reform, accepted seeing it as an opportunity to share what he had learned. Standing before an audience of government officials, business leaders, and academics, he spoke about the importance of transparency and accountability. He talked about how painful it could be to expose problems within institutions you cared about. He explained how short-term humiliation could lead to long-term strength. The audience listened respectfully. Some were skeptical, wondering if the palace reforms would last, or if things would eventually drift back to old patterns. Inspired seeing William as a leader who had faced a crisis honestly and emerged stronger. When he finished speaking, the applause was genuine and sustained that evening. Back at the palace, William and Catherine sat together in their private quarters. They talked about the day, about the children, about plans for the summer. The conversation was ordinary and domestic, a welcome contrast to the months of crisis. William felt a sense of peace that had been absent for a long time. He thought about Morrison, starting his prison sentence. He thought about Blackwood and Winters and Fletcher, each dealing with the consequences of their choices. He thought about Margaret Chen and Amanda Porter and all the people who had worked to expose problems and implement solutions. He thought about the palace staff, who had been frightened and uncertain during the investigations, but had ultimately supported the reforms most of all. He thought about what it meant to lead. Real leadership, he had learned, was not about maintaining appearances or protecting the institution at all costs. It was about having the courage to acknowledge failures and the determination to fix them. It was about accepting that sometimes doing the right thing meant enduring humiliation and criticism. It was about choosing long-term integrity over short-term. Comfort the scandal that had begun with one decision. To remove one guard from his position had exposed deep problems and created enormous embarrassment for the palace. But it had also created an opportunity for genuine reform. The palace was now more transparent, more accountable, and more trustworthy than it had been in generations. The price had been high, but the alternative would have been to let the rot continue until it caused even greater damage as spring turned to summer. Life at the palace found its new rhythm. The security teams operated with professionalism and integrity. The reforms became established practice rather than recent changes. The media attention continued to fade. And slowly, the scandal became part of history rather than current crisis. William knew the work was not finished. There would be new challenges, new problems, new failures to address. But he also knew that the palace was better equipped to handle them now. The systems were stronger, the culture was healthier, and the commitment to doing things right was genuine. The humiliation that had followed his decision to remove Morrison from his position had been intense and painful, but it had also been necessary and ultimately valuable. The palace had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. It had been forced to change in ways it had resisted for years. And while the process had been difficult, the result was an institution. Better prepared for the future, on a quiet evening, William walked through those same palace gardens once more. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. He thought about all that had happened since that morning when he had made his decision about Morrison. He thought about the investigations, the trials, the reforms, and the slow process of rebuilding trust. He had no regrets. The decision to remove Morrison had been right. The decision to investigate thoroughly had been right. The decision to embrace transparency and reform had been right. The humiliation had been real, but so was the progress that had followed. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not avoiding embarrassment or protecting the institution's image, but doing what was right and accepting whatever consequences followed. The palace would endure. The monarchy would continue. And perhaps, because of what had been exposed and addressed, both would be stronger and more worthy of the public's trust. That was the real legacy of this difficult period, not the scandal itself, but how it had been handled and what had been learned. William walked back inside as the last light faded from the sky, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring.